Every year around Easter, we see these memes pop up all over social media. We find claims that are made that Jesus is just a retelling of the Horus mythology. We see this portrayed in several ways, as I shared the memes that serve as the picture to this video, as articles, as arguments that are made even by notable comedians in our day. As followers of Jesus Christ, how do we respond to these sort of claims? Is Christianity just a repackaging? Well, the answer, of course, is no. Christianity Today, I'm sorry, Christianity.com, please forgive me there, Christianity.com asks the question in this way: is Jesus simply a retelling of the Horus mythology? Now, for some of those viewing today, you may ask the question simply, who is Horus? And that's a great question. You might remember from school when we learned about Egyptian mythology, or just through popular culture and fictional works, or maybe you're just interested in Egyptian history. You might remember that there is a deity who is depicted as having a falcon's head. That would be Horus. And so I'm going to read to you from strangenotions.com. I'm actually going to be, in this video, sharing from two different articles, the one on Christianity.com and this one from strangenotions.com. They are both linked in the description to this video, and I encourage you to follow those links, to read the resources, to examine the evidence for yourself. It is important that we do that. Also, I'm not sharing anything that's new. These are arguments that have been made by many people throughout the years, but I feel as though it's important to address this and to use these sources. I thought they were very good. So, who is Horus? This is from Strange Notions. Horus was one of the oldest recorded deities in Egyptian mythology. He is often depicted as a falcon or a man with a falcon's head, although I am unaware of any depictions of him in which he is fully a falcon. But over time, so initially he appeared as a local god, but over time, the ancient Egyptians came to believe the reigning pharaoh was a manifestation of Horus. And so we have this ancient deity who is worshipped, and his character is developed over 3,000 years of Egyptian mythology. And we find in our society today that there are a lot, especially among the unbelieving world, who around this time of the year will begin to point towards Horus and say, see, look at what he did. Look at the sort of titles that were attributed to him and the works. And then look at Jesus, whose earthly ministry is dated after the completed writings regarding Horus. And look, it's just a copycat. This is a watered down version of Horus. Is this something that Christians ought to believe? Well, of course not. But where did this idea ever come from? What's interesting, when we look at the history of the world, we find no such parallel drawn until the 19th century. And so it's the second half of the 19th century, during the 1800s, where you have a writer and an amateur Egyptian historian named Gerald Massey, who tries to draw parallels between Horus and Jesus. This is notable because it's during a time point, especially in Germany, for instance, where there was an effort to try to recognize that all religions have the same belief system, or they all worship the same God, or all of the great world religions come from mythology, and they just have been developed or expounded on over time. Now, these views have been completely abandoned within scholarship in our day. They have been out of favor in scholarship for well over 100 years, and yet we still see the layperson continue to repackage and present these arguments because they're unaware of the, I don't even want to say contemporary developments in scholarship, but they're unaware of the history of that argument and where it has gone. I've unpacked that argument itself several times and will gladly do so further in the future. But as it relates to this specific example, we may wonder, well, how did this obscure amateur Egyptian historian, how did this sort of belief that he had and these parallels that he drew, how did they become so recognized in our culture today? And it's probably, I believe, due to something that Bill Maher had said. Bill Maher, the comedian, who some people find funny, he said this, and this is from this is a direct quote can be found on StrangeNotions.com. It says, written in 1280 BC, the Book of the Dead describes a god, Horus. Horus is the son of the god Osiris, born of a virgin mother. He was baptized in a river by Anup, the baptizer, who was later beheaded. Like Jesus, Horus was tempted while alone in the desert, healed the sick, the blind, cast out demons, and walked on water. He raised Asser from the dead. Asser translates to Lazarus. Oh yeah, he also had 12 disciples. Yes, Horus was crucified first, and after 3 days, 2 women announced Horus, the savior of humanity, had been resurrected. So we find this claim that's made, and as you see in the thumbnail to this video, there are many memes that sort of depict these beliefs that Bill Maher had projected. J. Warner Wallace, the Christian apologist, in that Christianity.com article linked in the description, he opens up his article by asking this question. What if I told you there was once an ancient religion whose God was conceived by a virgin named Mary and had a stepfather named Seb, or Joseph? What if I told you this God was born in a cave and his birth was announced by an angel, heralded by a star and attended by shepherds? He attended a special rite of passage at the age of 12. At 30 years of age, this God was baptized in a river. His baptizer was later beheaded. He had 12 disciples, performed miracles, exorcised demons, raised someone from the dead, and even walked on water. They called him Lusa, the ever-becoming Son, the Holy Child. He delivered a sermon on a mount. He was crucified after coming to fulfill the law, and he rose from the dead. And I just provided a summary at the end of the argument that J. Warner Wallace was sharing, that many in our society will reflect upon or share during this time of the year. So these are the sort of arguments that are presented in a nutshell. I want to take time to unpack those, though. So just to reiterate again, these arguments were first made in the second half of the 19th century and never before. These parallels between Horus and Jesus, allegedly. And this is something that's gained favor because we've seen in our contemporary society that some notable figures, because of popularity, such as Bill Maher, have shared these parallels, and then the layperson in our society has picked them up and ran with them, and they share them as memes, as articles, in videos, and things of that like. And so as followers of Jesus Christ, we need to be able to give a response because it's important that people understand that Christianity is not simply a repackaging of the Horus mythology. So what are some of the basic claims that are made by those who are proponents of this view? Well, they will make the argument, again, that Horus was born of a virgin. Some will suggest that he was born on December 25th. Now, there's a few problems with this. The first, of course, being that Christianity does not rise or fall on Jesus' birth being December 25th. In fact, the Bible doesn't give us a date for Jesus' birth at all. Very early Christians were not concerned in the least bit with the birth of Jesus. We do find, however, that early Christians who were interested in the birth of Jesus and establishing a date for, I should have said a date for Jesus' birth, not his birth. They were very interested in that. But establishing a date for the birth of Jesus did settle in North Africa on December 25th. But the reason that they did so was not because they were trying to repackage something that was pagan or because they were trying to cover up the winter solstice, which is so often claimed. Instead, what they believed, and this is something that's a common belief, was a common belief in antiquity, was that the date that you died happened to correspond with the date in which you were conceived. And so if you wanted to establish somebody's birth date, all you would do is you'd look at the date that they died, you would move forward 9 months, and guess what? You'd have a birth date, and that's how that calculation was made, and it happened to settle on December 25th. There are good arguments for believing Jesus was not, in fact, born on that date, and again, Christians are not dogmatic about this at all. But was Horus born on December 25th, and was he born of a virgin? Well, there is no date given for Horus's birth either, other than it is stated that it was around the winter solstice, so it is sometime around December 21st. But that should be expected in mythology. Also, he was not in any way born of a virgin. Isis, who is his mother, is nowhere depicted as a virgin. And so the story that is shared regarding his birth is pretty explicit, to be honest, and I'm going to try to share it in as watered down of a version as I can. And again, please take note for little ears. And if you have to skip ahead a minute, please feel free to do so. But Osiris had this great enemy, Set or Seth, who's a depiction of evil. He's one of Osiris's brothers, and he has this conflict with Osiris, and he later would with Horus. And so what he does, he cuts Osiris up into 14 pieces. Isis goes around looking for the pieces of her husband, and she can't find all of them. Notably, she is missing his reproductive organ, and so one is refashioned out of gold. I've seen out of wax, but primarily out of gold. And then she has relations with Osiris, and that is how she is impregnated with the child who will become Horus, or who is Horus. Now, is that in any way a virgin birth? Do we hear like the Gospel of Luke in that story? Not quite. Okay, so there's no similarity there. So Horus is not born of a virgin, and he was not born on December 25th. And again, Christians are not dogmatic about Jesus being born on December 25th, and Scripture doesn't affirm that as a date at all. Well, does Horus have 12 disciples? No, he does not have 12 disciples, and there are no depictions of him having them. There's this idea that he has this conflict with Seth. And so Seth is this evil figure. We're told in some of these alleged parallels that he leads Horus into the wilderness and he tempts him for a period of time. There's no such depiction at all. In fact, the way that Horus is believed to have gained dominion over Seth is very sexually graphic, to the extent that I can't even try to retell it in a way that's watered down. I would encourage you to, if you're so led or interested, to read about Egyptian history for yourself on that matter. I just don't think it's appropriate to dive into that. But the fact that that is so graphic and explicit should tip your hat to the fact that the way that he counters temptation and the attacks of Seth are radically different than the way that Jesus resists the temptation of Satan in the wilderness, for which he uses Scripture, by the way. We are told that Horus was crucified, and as a consequence, of course, he dies. Now, this is something that really should tip people's hat. I mean, this is something that should indicate for those who see these memes that this is in no way accurate. What is crucifixion? How common was it in the ancient world? How common was it in Egyptian history? Do we have any accounts of people being crucified in Egyptian mythology, of deities being crucified? No. Crucifixion is a Roman death penalty. That's what it is. It's a punishment, of course, that results in death. And so we find this under the Romans. We do not find this under the Egyptians. There are no depictions of Horus being crucified. There are paintings in which his arms are stretched out. But that's a pretty big leap to say somebody's arms are stretched out and then saying, see, it's a picture of crucifixion. But to an amateur Egyptian historian such as Gerald Massey, this apparently is very convincing evidence. There are pictures where his arms are strapped down, and they're strapped down to a sandal strap. But that's actually a picture of life in Egyptian culture, not of death. And so it was not a gateway to death. It was in no way a punishment, certainly not a tool used for capital punishment. Another problem with this is that Horus doesn't die. So there's an account early in his life, again, a mythology. He's not a historical figure. There's no archaeology. There's no history that affirms his existence in any way. The next person that has a falcon head, I would be very interested to see. So what we find is that he is stung in the stories, by a scorpion, and he is near death. He is so sick, but he's still very much alive because he's resisting some of the aid that people are trying to give him. So what happens is that this other god comes and offers a spell that draws the scorpion's venom from him, which enables him to be made well. This is in no way a picture of the death and burial of Jesus Christ. Remember, Jesus was betrayed by his fellow countrymen, by people who opposed the claims that he had to being the Son of God. They rejected the claims that he was the Messiah. They were jealous of him. They thought he was a threat to them because he was. He challenged their authority and the teachings that they had shared. And so they handed Jesus over to the Romans. He died on a cross, which again was a tool for capital punishment, and he was sealed in a tomb. This is in no way a picture of what happens to Horus. And you could examine the Book of the Dead all you would like, and you won't find anything like this. And by the way, going back to what Bill Mayer had said there is not a singular Book of the Dead. So he says, it was written in 1280 BC. No, this is an account of many myths and magical spells that are developed over centuries. So there's not like a date in which there's a publisher's, there's a date in which it was copywritten or something. And there's not one uniform, Book of the Dead that was compiled and dated on a certain point. Instead, we have all these myths and these stories and these magical spells that are compiled over an extended period of time. But if you were to examine those, you would not find a single case of somebody being crucified, and you won't find Horus dying. In fact, Horus becomes recognized with pharaohs. And so each new pharaoh, when they are anointed as pharaoh, they are seen as now being Horus in the flesh. And by the way, when they die, they become Osiris. They don't become a dead Horus. They simply move into the underworld and they become Osiris. And that's what happens to them. And so we don't have anything serving as a parallel to the death, burial of Jesus Christ. Along the lines, though, of the alleged death of Horus, and again, that's even a misunderstanding of what happens, because he simply is stung by a scorpion and is poisoned, but he doesn't die. But along those lines, so what the Egyptians come to believe is that if you use the same spell that was used to draw the venom from Horus, that would provide healing. And so it's a magical incantation that uses the alleged same spell that was given to Horus. And that is how people are so-called healed by Horus. And so when they say, well, Horus did all these miracles and Jesus did these miracles, people mean very different things. There's a magical spell that was used on Horus that is then applied and used in other cases as a magical spell, where we have Jesus going out in the countryside and healing people. We find him laying hands on people. We see him speaking and people are made well. We find him calling forth for Lazarus from the grave, and he comes forth. And as I shared, they try to say that Aser can be translated as Lazarus. But this is also a misunderstanding. Actually, Aser in in Egyptian mythology here is actually Osiris. That's what that name would mean. And so there is no Lazarus or any equivalence in Egyptian mythology or history. Lazarus is actually an updated translation of Eliezer, and that's where that name originates, not in Egyptian culture. Continuing on, what about the resurrection? Don't they believe that Horus was resurrected? He died on a cross and he's resurrected. Isn't that what people have come to believe? Well, again, he doesn't die. He certainly doesn't die on a Roman cross or on any sort of a cross. He's not crucified. And so there is no resurrection. There's no such example in Egyptian mythology. And so any parallel that is attempted to be drawn between the resurrection of Jesus Christ and Horus is simply a late-date fabrication, and it does not in any way exist. And so J. Warner Wallace touches on this figure who wrote, this individual wrote Strange Notions, touches on this as well. Well, what do we do with that as followers of Jesus Christ? Well, it's important that we can speak clearly about the claims that are made and the alleged parallels that are drawn between mythological figures and Jesus. When somebody projects this, or they share it with us, and they say, look at this parallel, we should ask them, well, demonstrate for me the source of where this belief originated. Tell me where it says in Egyptian mythology that Horus died and was resurrected. Share with me how he performed miracles. Tell me how he was baptized. By the way, there's no baptism here in Egyptian times, although there were likely purification rites for people who were anointed as Pharaoh and then recognized as Horus. But these are very different things. And Anup, the alleged baptizer of Horus, never exists. There's no character in Egyptian history. And so because he never exists, he's never baptized. And so these sort of things, or he's never beheaded. So these sort of parallels that are attempted to be drawn are fabrications. They're completely fictional as Horus himself happens to be. So we should push back on that. Show me the source for the claim that you are making. We should speak clearly about the origination of these parallels, that they were developed in the second half of the 19th century. We should speak clearly about how individuals such as Bill Mayer and others who share memes and other stories like this are just projecting something that is false, something that they haven't obviously examined for themselves. But the other thing we should do is we should speak clearly about the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The attempt is made to frame Jesus's works as being just the product of myth, that they are inventions, that they are created. There are several problems with this. And I touched on this in a sermon a few weeks ago. There's a lot of writing and other resources on this subject. I would encourage you to examine that evidence for yourself, but just to touch on a few points here. We understand that myths develop over an extended period of time. They originate long after eyewitnesses are gone, when people can't make credible arguments for or against a truth claim. And so what we find, for instance, regarding Horus is that he has developed over thousands of years. In fact, people who live towards the end of the worship of Horus, they are probably unfamiliar with many of the beliefs that early followers of Horus would have maintained, or the things that they believe about him are radically different than the character that is understood in the beginning. Is this true of Christianity? Well, no. We find that the eyewitnesses of Jesus, that his very disciples, they see him alive. And they act as though they saw him alive. They're not confused about the location of the tomb. Joseph of Arimathea, it was his tomb in which Jesus was buried. So his tomb was known. There were eyewitnesses who saw the empty tomb. And not only did they see the empty tomb, but they saw the resurrected Lord. And they don't simply say, on the basis of faith, I believe this occurred. They say that they see this. And not only do they say that they see that, but they're willing to die for the truth claim that they make. And of the 11 disciples, of course, Judas had hung himself. Out of the 11 disciples that remain, 10 of them die a martyr's death for the truth claim that they make that Jesus rose from the dead, which is compelling evidence. We find that there are extra biblical testimonies that indicate very early that Christians were teaching that Jesus died on a Roman cross, that he was sealed in a tomb, that on the third day he rose from the dead, and that there were eyewitnesses to this fact. Pliny the Younger, Tacitus are examples of extra biblical sources that say that Christians believed this very early and they lived as though it was true. Jesus is a well-documented historical figure. The movement that follows, because people claim he rose from the dead, is very notable as well. There is no explanation as to the origin of this truth claim that Jesus rose from the dead within the contemporary society in which it originated. There is no reason to believe that it is a recounting of mythology, because the mythological accounts that predate the resurrection of Jesus do not describe anything related or anywhere relevant to what we find in the gospel accounts of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so we should speak clearly about the evidence that we have for the empty tomb, for the resurrected Lord. We should speak clearly about the historicity of those claims. We should describe in detail the evidence that is provided to indicate that Jesus rose from the dead. There is no such evidence regarding Horus's alleged life, death, or so-called resurrection. These are simply fabrications of an amateur Egyptian historian that people still believe today and try to draw parallels with to the resurrection of Jesus. I hope that encourages you today. I hope it provides a measure of confidence for you. When you see these sort of memes, you can simply dismiss them. When you see these sort of claims, when you have unbelieving friends and family who say, well, look, Christianity is just a repackaging of myth, you can speak clearly into these ways. And I do encourage you to those claims. I encourage you to read these articles, examine this evidence further for yourself. I look forward to worshiping with you on this upcoming Sunday. May God bless you.